Ahead on Straight Talk.
Workers' rights, worth the fight!
Across the nation and right here in the Pacific Northwest, we're seeing a wave of labor actions unlike anything in recent history. From the first Portland teacher strike to Oregon's first major doctor strike and largest healthcare strike in state history.
We've been at the bargaining table, spelling these things out to them very clearly.
Workers are walking off the job demanding better wages, better conditions, and a stronger voice, while employers weigh how to meet demands while balancing their budgets.
You have to manage those two dials, or you could put your school district in insolvency. We don't want to do that.
We take a look at the significance of this moment and explore what's fueling the rise of collective labor actions, plus what it means for consumers, workers, and the economy at large. Right now on Straight Talk. Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Stephanie Doe-Marat. Now, over the last few years, we've seen several high-profile labor strikes here in the Northwest and nationwide. Federal data shows a significant increase in strike activity in the U.S. over the last 20 years. Strikes by the United Auto Workers Union, Oregon educators, and most recently the Providence healthcare workers strike has brought to light what can be a complex relationship between employers and their workers as they provide goods and services for the society. Now, today we will aim to answer the question of why strikes are increasing and what it means for the average consumer. We have two guests joining us this week to break this all down. Dr. Eric Fruits is a senior scholar at the International Center for Law and Economics. He's also an adjunct professor of economics at Portland State University. Also joining us is Dr. Mark Rodriguez, a professor of history at Portland State. Rodriguez is an expert in social and protest movements and a contributor to the academic journal Labor Studies and Working Class History. Eric, Mark, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks
it's such
an
interesting topic, so I'm glad to have this discussion. Okay, first, I want to begin with kind of a big picture context question. As with many things, to understand what's happening today, it's important to look back at what's happened before. So, Mark, can you give us kind of a brief history of the labor movement, when it began and why?
Yeah, most of it began in the 19th century. This is a period where there are almost no labor protections for workers, federal, state level, city level. Basically, if you work, it's at will. If something happens, you lose your job. AFL comes out of this, trades workers, and think about electricians, people like that, carpenters. And then in the 1930s, you have the Wagner Act, which brings us the CIO, and those are all sorts of other workers. And it evolves over time to expand into many various sectors of the economy, including public sector, hospital sector, things like that we're seeing today. But it really starts with those kind of traditional working class jobs. You think about carpenters, pipe fitters, things like that.
Some that were potentially dangerous sometimes.
Yeah, often quite dangerous.
Okay.
Now they have much more protection.
Yes. Okay. And so according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I want to get into this a little more. The highest number of strikes that we saw was back in 1952, 470. So similar, like you were mentioning, in the earlier 1900s. The lowest was in 2009, only 5 work stoppages were recorded. This is such a massive variation, such a difference. What could have contributed during those years, both in the high and in the low? Mark, let's start with you.
Right, we go back to the early 1950s, high inflation, Korean War, post-World War II. There's a lot of pressure on wages, or at least workers feel that. And there's also a very different system for the way that they're able to organize. And it's going to bring about something that changes things radically, and that's Taft-Hartley.
Okay, so tell us more about that.
Yeah, so the Taft-Hartley Act comes in. You have Republicans in Congress that see these strikes as problematic, and they begin to think about ways to remedy what they saw as some of the problems with the Wagner Act, which is a New Deal Act, which really created opportunity for the CIO. Many labor unions today see the Taft-Hartley as something they would still like to do away with because it limits their power in very serious ways.
So when we saw 400 and something strikes in the 50s, like what exactly was happening during that time that people were striking so much?
I think probably driven by inflation, but I would defer to my colleague who probably remembers that a little bit more. Yeah,
what do you think?
Well, you had inflation. You also had, relatively high employment. The neat contrast is 2009, where you said you had the lowest number of strikes. Remember, that was, right pretty much the beginning or the middle of what we now call the Great Recession. So, there was a time where people are feeling kind of lucky just to have a job.
Interesting.
And so a lot of times when you look at the economic pressures that lead to strikes, right? You tend to see where you have a feeling of a shrinking pie, and so you want to get a bigger slice of that smaller pie. Also, when you have the labor side of it feeling more power because you have high employment. So right now in Oregon, we've got really high labor force participation rate. In other words, a lot of people want to work. We have really low unemployment, which means that people who want to work are finding jobs. And so that kind of makes you feel have a better bargaining position as an employee to negotiate, because where else are those employers going to go to find labor? And so that gives you a little bit added incentive to possibly push harder and maybe go on strike.
Okay, interesting. And then talking about today and what we're seeing, just to give you some of those numbers, and the number of strikes over the past 20 years has risen. In 2023, we saw the highest number in the last 2 decades with 33. That was more than 6 times what we saw back in 2009 with 5. So it's not, not the 50s where we saw 400, but this is quite a significant difference, it seems. Would you say so?
Yes, and there's more than one factor always at play. I think with the inflation that we had in 2022 and part of 2023, there was this feeling that the pie either wasn't growing or was getting smaller, and so people wanted to get a bigger share of that. But the other thing you have to remember is that we felt inflation. I mean, my goodness, I just spent $4 for a gallon of milk at Fred Meyer. And so we feel that as consumers and as workers. But also you have to remember that our employers, the businesses, are also facing that inflationary pressure, and their margins are getting squeezed. And so the workers want to get more out of the businesses, and the businesses don't know where to go because they can't really raise their prices. And so there's this pressure where there may not be an easy place to meet in the middle, and that kind of raises the tension.
And
Mark,
if they're represented, they're supposed to work these things out through collective bargaining, or if there are opportunities in their contracts to reopen things for economic reasons. But they're both going to bring their data, and so those input costs for employers, whether it's state and government employers or whether it's private sector employers, let's just say make it really simple. If they're making omelets, the price of those eggs have gone up too, right? So that's an input cost that's gone up, right? So hopefully, if they are organized and they already have collective bargaining agreements, they should be able to discuss these things in a way that's sensible.
What do you think? Is there anything else that you think is contributing to this kind of shift we're seeing right now with more?
Yeah, I think the real driver right now is inflation.
Okay.
I think many of the demands are about cost of living increases that workers want, and I think many workers that aren't in unions probably also want cost of living increases. But again, the idea that we have a really tight labor market means that workers that are getting hired in fast food are getting paid more than they would have 5 years ago, right? So,
do you foresee this trend to keep ticking upwards in the next coming year?
Well, I think another thing that we saw, especially recently in the uptick, is that the Biden administration was not just pro-labor, but pro-labor unions. If I recall correctly, President Biden was the first sitting president to join a picket line. And so I think that gave the unions a little bit more courage to be a little bit more militant or aggressive in negotiating strategy. Now, with Trump as president, he's a Republican. They're traditionally not as keen on labor unions, but this president's different, right? Because I think you can make a case that there were quite a few labor unions who actually pulled him over the finish line. And I think he feels like he owes them something. Now, what that something is, we don't know.
Yeah,
There's
and we'll
always a
talk about
split.
that more in the second half of the show, because that's definitely interesting, especially with his labor secretary nominee. So we'll talk about that too. But I want to talk about kind of what we're seeing right now with strikes. Something that's also new is we seem to be seeing different people who are striking or different people who are unionizing. For example, we're seeing the resolution, hopefully, of the biggest hospital worker strike in Oregon's history right now. It includes doctors for the first time ever. This seemed very significant. So, this is a shift from who we historically would see striking. Mark, let's start with you. Can you explain why you think we're seeing this change?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about labor unions, you think about people with those traditional trades jobs. But now we have many professionals who feel like they are not sort of free-floating professionals, but rather they're just employees. And when you feel like you're just an employee, chances are you might be encouraged or feel that it makes more sense to pursue contracts or join a union. And so I think to have doctors who we often see as free-floating professionals who kind of chart their own path, now they see themselves, at least in some circumstances, as employees.
Do you think we are going to see more of this, or other industries that are maybe, higher educated or higher skilled, as you want to call them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it always is driven by competition. And so if you think about workers that, we might see as very high skilled workers, computer programmers, people like that, but if they're working in a place that feels like a factory to them, they might pursue bargaining.
Interesting. What do you think?
Well, with Providence, you've got a bunch of things going on. So, there's always pay component, but another part of it with Providence is the amount of work they're doing. And I mentioned that we have a really tight labor market, and so that pressure can't be relieved by hiring more people to reduce the workload. So, a big part of the negotiations was over the workload. The other thing too is, again, facing the cost pressures on both sides, Providence is probably going to say, we can't afford to pass this on to insurers, because if you look out there, Providence dropped Aetna as an insurer in the beginning of January. And I think part of that was in some way due to these increasing labor costs, because Aetna said, we aren't going to pay the fees you're charging. So there's pressure there. And I think if you're the unions, you're going to push back on Providence and say, look, if you have enough money to put your name on a soccer stadium, then you probably have enough money to pay us a little bit more.
All right, shifting to the public sector. In the last year and a half, we saw collective action, significant collection actions among school districts. We saw Portland's teachers striking for the first time ever. Shortly after, we saw Salem-Keizer teachers vote to authorize a strike, though they avoided one through mediation. And then in the Albany School District, teachers there participated in the first strike in nearly 40 years. So we're clearly seeing a change with this, with more teachers willing to hit the picket lines. Why are we seeing this all at once, and sometimes for the first time ever? Who wants to go?
Well, when you're looking at the public sector, a big part of it is there's this big gap between what the public employee brings home and what they actually cost the employer, cost the school district.
Right.
And a big part of that is because of PERS. And PERS is always the 800-pound gorilla that underlies every single public policy problem in Oregon. Every single one of them goes back to PERS. And I think what you have here is that the teachers rightfully are saying, we aren't being compensated enough, because when they look at their paycheck, it doesn't feel like it's growing. But you look at the district and they say, gosh, our payroll costs are going through the roof. That's money that those teachers and other school workers don't see. And it makes it really hard to negotiate in good faith when you're really looking at two different sets of numbers and you can't agree on them.
And we saw budget cuts that came out after the Portland teachers strike as a result of that budget issue. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that, oftentimes people point to PERS as a big driver. And I'm a member of PERS, member of a union at Portland State, and I think, these things come up all the time. So your salary is not your only component. You have your benefits, you have these other issues related to PERS. And so when public employees might have a low salary, they might have a benefit package that others in the private sector might wish they had. And so that's the disconnect. And there's always going to be this need for collaboration, discussion, and quite honestly, compromise when it comes to districts and government entities dealing with their workers. And so what you see is often the demands are higher than what they're actually going to agree to, because it's a process. It's oftentimes very adversarial. But I also think, as a public employee myself, one of the things that we like to point out is that we do deliver value to the people of Oregon, and that really matters, whether it's teaching kids, whether it's police officers, and folks in the fire department, things like that. And so public service, you often take a lower paycheck, but you do it because you support the mission of the state of Oregon or Portland State University or teaching kids in our public schools.
Do you think the fact that we saw, the largest school district in Oregon go on strike, and then we saw another district go on strike, do you think that kind of played into the momentum? And that played into a factor?
I think it could play a role. I think the other thing that's really important when you're looking at governments like school districts is there's a certain amount of magical thinking among the school districts, in the sense that they think, okay, we can really satisfy the union's demands because we could just go to Salem and ask for more money, right? That seems to be that's the answer. There's a money tree in Salem. We just get to pick some leaves off and that'll solve all our problems. Well, now Salem's got that problem, and that's where the buck stops. And so I think we're going to see some real stress. And I think when you look out there at the state budget, this is going to be probably the first time since the Great Recession that the legislature is going to actually have to consider dealing with cutting programs instead of just not growing them as much as they'd like. And so I think there's going to be some real stress down there in Salem this year, and that's going to trickle through into labor disputes, I think.
Well, I want to talk more about how you mentioned that these strikes can be very adversarial, they can be contentious. They've also, leaned into public support sometimes too, right? The teachers or the grocery workers. How do you think public perception plays a role when workers are choosing to strike?
It absolutely does, because the union wants to define the thing, whether it's teaching kids or policing the streets, as the public benefit that these people are pushing for. And the emphasis will be on fairness, right? So they're talking about fair wages, fair working hours, things like that. And they really need to focus on crafting that message in a way that doesn't upset the people of Oregon or the people of their school district with the sort of issue of cost. But one of my colleagues said something a few years ago, and it was, we don't want to bargain ourselves out of jobs. So the union also needs to think about what the reality is, what those budget issues are down in Salem, and think seriously about what our economy looks like in Oregon when they're asking for things that might actually be followed with a contract and then layoffs, because that happens quite a lot.
All right, we are out of time for this half, but we are going to be right back after this break. So when we come back, we will continue our conversation about collective labor actions, including how they impact the economy or the average consumer, plus what former Congresswoman Lori Chavez-DeRemer's confirmation as labor secretary could mean for the unions across the country. We'll be right back. And welcome back. We are continuing our conversation with Dr. Eric Fruits and Dr. Mark Rodriguez on the rise in labor protests in our region and nationwide and how it impacts you, the average American. Thank you both for being here today. Super interesting topic, so I'm glad. Let's get right back into it. Okay, Eric, these strikes, they don't happen in a vacuum. In fact, they're very disruptive. Sometimes that's the point of them, right?
Yep.
So how do strikes affect the broader economy, and what impact do they have on the industries that are involved and then the average consumer?
Well, strikes are disruptive, and they're designed to be disruptive. And there's a cost, for a lot of those strikers. They may get paid during the strike, but they're not getting paid as much as they were when they weren't striking. So you do take a financial hit when you're striking. And of course, the businesses suffer from not having those workers and can't serve people, and may even have diminished customer service because of that. And so all those factors ripple through the economy. And then when you're talking about public sector union strikes, and especially if they result in pay increases, you could be talking about some relatively substantial fiscal impacts. I think what I heard most recently is the city of Portland just averted a strike by offering essentially $22 million more to their public employees. And we already have a $100 million budget shortfall. So now you're talking about a 20% increase in the shortfall to placate those unions. That money has to come from somewhere. What do you see how does this impact the industries itself? Like, do we see unions who are striking change maybe people who aren't in a union but in that same industry? What about you, Eric?
Well, yeah, I think, there's always pressure. So, for example, if you're in a unionized steelworkers facility and a non-unionized steelworkers facility exists in the same area, they can deliver things for less money. They have lower costs for labor, things like that. I did work in a steel mill as a young person, and I remember this, that I was at the non-union steel mill, and the prices that they charged were less for things.
Interesting.
Well, it's also fascinating, too, is a lot of times people talk about, how unions provide so much better benefits and compensation. But if you look around, for example, in the grocery world, you have Fred Meyer and Safeway that are unionized. Those workers are pretty happy. But you also talk to Trader Joe's workers and Costco workers who aren't unionized. They're also pretty happy. And so I think when you have a competitive labor market, this all kind of evens out because the Costco and TJ's workers may be getting paid a little bit more than the union workers in exchange for having not as significant benefits. And so I think it all kind of evens out, and that's what's nice about having what I think is a relatively competitive labor market across most of the economy.
It's true, because the whole benefits package really, right, the whole compensation package can be different than maybe just the salary. That makes sense.
That's
okay.
right.
Yeah. All right, let's switch gears a bit. Let's look at the effect of laws and government in all of this. So in the last couple of decades, we've seen a shift among working class voters away from the Democratic Party and more towards the Republican Party. President Trump specifically campaigned and appealed appealed to much of the working class in his last election. We spoke a little bit about this earlier, many of whom historically would be more likely to be represented by unions. So, Mark, given what we have seen from President Trump in his first administration, his first presidency, what can we expect for unions and labor laws in now his second term?
Yeah, that's a fascinating change. I think we're seeing a split between union leadership and rank and file. And if we step out a little bit and leave the Pacific Northwest, many of the people in unions in the Midwest, East Coast, and other places tend to be more socially conservative. And so they might see themselves as having a very different point of view than their leaders. I grew up in Wisconsin, and I know that Wisconsin's one of those states that flips back and forth. And, many of the people there, are much more conservative than, say, somebody in that same union based here in Portland. And so I think looking forward, what we're going to see is a continued discourse between rank and file and leadership about how they see themselves politically.
Do you expect what do you expect, I guess, from President Trump in his second term? Do you have
I don't
any
know what to
idea?
expect on any given day with our new president, but
Yeah.
I do think, for example, the Teamsters head spoke at the RNC. That's different. And again, that rank and file split versus the leaders of the union split is something that's, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Do you think that could have any impact directly, though, here in Oregon and Washington, as being that we have protections that may not be in place in other states? Eric, what do you think?
I'm not sure about that. And I think going back to Trump, I think he really supported the longshoremen. I think if the Teamsters asked for something, he'd give something to them. I don't know if he's going to be transactional about this. My guess is he's probably going to act a bit like a kind of a conservative Democrat, because that seems to be his leaning on. He's definitely not anti-union. But I don't think he's as full-throated supporter of unions as Joe Biden was. I don't think you'll see Trump on a picket line, right? And so I think you might see a more measured approach, and you might see that too. I think Lori Chavez-DeRemer was a very interesting pick, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit. But that's,
Yes.
Again, but as Mark said, who knows what's going to happen with Donald Trump?
Yeah.
I've been blown away by everything he's done in the past 15 days, mainly because I had no idea it was coming.
Yeah, so we will see. Yeah, and speaking of Lori Chavez-DeRemer, she is his pick for Labor Secretary, his nominee. As a congresswoman, she was pro-worker when she supported the PRO Act, which would beef up labor protections for employees and expand the scope of what counts as an unfair labor practice. So members of Trump's party have spoken out in opposition to her nomination, have said they're not going to vote for her. They're not going to allow this to go through. Conversely, though, she's gotten a lot of support from unions. So her hearing is scheduled for this week, so we will see what happens. But I do want to ask, Eric, what kind of power does the labor secretary role have, and really could this impact the labor laws that we see?
Yeah, I think what a lot of people miss about government, they always put their eye on Congress and what sort of laws they've passed. Congress hardly does anything these days, right? Where the real action is in the administrative state. And so the Department of Labor can do a lot of good, a lot of harm through its rulemaking process, and how the Department of Labor wants to handle issue of things like overtime rules, break rules, and so forth. That can have substantial impacts that don't require a vote of Congress or the president signing off on it.
Interesting.
And so far, Lori Chavez-DeRemer hasn't really hinted how she would promulgate those rules, but it'll probably be quite a bit of a departure from the Biden administration.
What do you think?
Well, one of the things that strikes me is that if you have somebody that has support from labor unions being appointed by a Republican, there are other things that the administration could do. So if seats come open in the NLRB, that's the National Labor Relations Board, you could have somebody appointed by a Republican who actually is more pro-worker. Now, that would be a change.
Yeah, it would. I guess we will see. I know this is coming up fast, so we'll see this week with her nomination, the confirmation hearings. But such a great topic. Thank you so much for both of you for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
It was such an interesting thing. I learned a lot, so thank you. Dr. Fruits and Dr. Rodriguez, again, thank you so much. So next week on Straight Talk, we will speak with a leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion. She gives us her take on the national trend to remove DEI programs and initiatives and what it could mean for us here in Oregon and Washington. But before we go, a reminder that you can stream Straight Talk on your own schedule anytime. You can download the free KGW Plus app, available now on Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV. And we'll see you next week here on Straight Talk. Thanks for watching, and until then, be well.